The California Riviera that died twice, the true story of Bombay Beach and the sea that made it, killed it, and made it strange. About 120 miles east of San Diego, in a salt-crusted desert basin 223 feet below sea level, on the shore of a lake that should not exist, sits a small grid of weathered trailers and abandoned bungalows that almost nobody who lives in California has ever heard of. The lake stretches 35 miles north and is bordered by salt flats and the bones of dead fish. The smell on a hot day can carry for miles. The town that sits on its eastern shore is called Bombay Beach. It is the lowest elevation community in the United States. It was once a celebrity resort that rivaled Yosemite for annual visitors. It was killed by the very lake that built it. And then, against every reasonable expectation, it was brought partway back to life by a small group of artists who decided the most apocalyptic place in California was also the most beautiful. To understand Bombay Beach, you first have to understand the Salton Sea. And to understand the Salton Sea, you have to understand that it should not be there. The Salton Trough, a long, deep, dry basin in the southeastern corner of California, was for thousands of years a salt-crusted lakebed. Geologically, it had filled and emptied many times. The Colorado River, before it was tamed by 20th century dams, used to wander across its broad delta in the desert. Sometimes the river ran south to the Gulf of California. Sometimes it ran north into the trough, filled the basin, and slowly evaporated back into dust over the course of decades. The lake had a name in the geological record: Lake Cahuilla. By the time American settlers arrived in the 1800s, it had been dry for centuries. Then, in the year 1905, human engineers attempted to divert a portion of the Colorado River to irrigate the new agricultural settlements of the Imperial Valley. They cut an irrigation channel from the river through the desert. And then, almost immediately, things went wrong. The river broke through the temporary control gates. The full flow of the Colorado River, instead of running through a controlled canal, poured directly into the dry Salton Trough at full force. For nearly 2 years, from the spring of 1905 until the gates were finally closed in February of 1907, the entire Colorado River emptied itself into the desert basin. By the time engineers finally choked off the breach, a vast new lake covered the bottom of the Salton Trough. It was 35 miles long, 15 miles wide, and in places more than 50 feet deep. It was the largest inland body of water in the state of California. It had not existed 3 years earlier. It was, depending on how you looked at it, either an accident, a disaster, or a miracle. And it was already starting to evaporate. For a couple of decades, almost nothing happened at the new lake. It was hot, it was remote, and the surrounding land was salt-crusted desert that nobody particularly wanted to live in. Then, in 1929, a real estate developer named R.E. Gilligan looked at a stretch of land along the eastern shore of the Salton Sea, 223 feet below sea level, and saw an opportunity. The lake, by sheer geographic accident, was now a year-round body of water in one of the warmest, sunniest climates in the United States. You could swim in it in December. You could water ski on it in February. You could buy beachfront property for almost nothing. Gilligan platted a small grid of streets on the eastern shore and named it Bombay Beach, borrowing the name, vaguely, from the famous Indian Ocean port. He marketed it as the next Riviera. For a while, almost nothing happened there either. The Great Depression hit. The Second World War came. The lake sat in the desert, slowly getting a little saltier each year as agricultural runoff from the Imperial Valley drained into it. The handful of fishermen who lived at Bombay Beach noticed that the fish were getting bigger and the salt water was warmer than the ocean. And then, in the 1950s, the entire American leisure economy discovered the place. The Salton Sea in the early 1950s was the perfect storm of post-war American optimism. It was a warm, calm inland sea, 2 hours from the new freeways of Southern California. The fish were enormous. The water skiing was excellent. The weather was 9 months of summer, and the entire shoreline was undeveloped beachfront property selling for prices that would not be possible anywhere on the coast. Resorts went up at a furious pace. Bombay Beach grew from a handful of cottages to a full-grown town. Marinas, restaurants, motels, drive-in theaters. The lake hosted speedboat races, national sport fishing tournaments, beauty contests. By the mid-1950s, the Salton Sea was drawing roughly 1.5 million visitors a year, more annual visitors than Yosemite National Park. In 1959, the North Shore Beach and Yacht Club opened on the western shore as the largest marina in Southern California. Celebrities came down from Hollywood. Frank Sinatra was photographed water skiing. Bing Crosby owned property on the shore. Sonny Bono would later own a vacation home in the area. The Beach Boys recorded songs about it. For about 15 years, in the middle of the 20th century, a desert town in California sitting on a lake that had not existed 60 years earlier was briefly one of the most fashionable destinations on the American leisure map. And then very slowly, the lake began to die. The problem was the same one that had built the lake. The Salton Sea had no natural outlet. It was a closed basin, a bathtub with no drain. The only water coming in was agricultural runoff from the Imperial Valley to the south. That runoff carried fertilizer, pesticides, salt, and concentrated minerals. The only water leaving the lake was evaporation. The water evaporated. The salts and chemicals stayed. Every year, the lake got a little saltier and a little more polluted than the year before. By the late 1960s, the salinity of the Salton Sea had passed the level of the Pacific Ocean. By the 1970s, the lake was 30% saltier than the ocean. Fish began to die in mass die-offs that washed thousands of carcasses onto the beach at Bombay Beach every spring. The smell in the dry desert heat became overwhelming. The birds that fed on the fish died too. The resorts began to close. The celebrities stopped coming. By the early 1980s, the Salton Sea had become one of the most ecologically distressed bodies of water in the United States, and Bombay Beach, 223 feet below sea level on its eastern shore, was emptying out. The decline of Bombay Beach in the 1980s and 90s was slow, absolute, and almost cinematic in its strangeness. Residents left. Trailers were abandoned in place. The drive-in theater closed. The marinas were boarded up. The lake kept receding from the shoreline, leaving behind a beach made entirely of crushed fish bones, dried salt, and the chemical residue of half a century of agricultural runoff. The town, built to hold 1,000 residents, dropped below 500, then below 300. By the early 2000s, fewer than 200 people lived there year-round. The buildings that remained were eaten by the desert. Trailers leaned, roofs collapsed, murals faded, mannequins appeared, abandoned, in front yards. The empty motels filled with sand. The hottest summer days routinely topped 120 degrees. The wind in the spring picked up the dust of the exposed lakebed, laced with decades of pesticide and fertilizer concentrate, and carried it across the trailers in toxic clouds that locals called playa storms. Bombay Beach became, in the loose national imagination, a kind of California version of Chernobyl, a still inhabited ruin in a beautiful, ruined place. And then, around 2010, something unexpected began to happen. Photographers started showing up, then filmmakers, then a particular kind of artist, the kind who is drawn to abandoned places, to apocalyptic landscapes, to ruins that have not been polished into tourist attractions. They took pictures of the murals and the mannequins. They built small installations on the empty lots. A few of them bought trailers for almost nothing and moved in. In 2016, an Italian-American filmmaker named Tao Ruspoli, together with two collaborators named Stefan Ashkenazi and Lily Johnson White, organized the first edition of an event they called the Bombay Beach Biennale. It was a free, non-commercial gathering. 3 days of site-specific art installations, performances, lectures, and what one journalist called desert philosophy. The first year, a few hundred people attended. The next year, more. The year after that, more still. By the late 2010s, the Bombay Beach Biennale had become an annual destination for outsider artists, academics, filmmakers, and photographers from across the United States and Europe. The trailers that had been abandoned in the 80s were now covered in murals. A grand piano sat permanently in the middle of the exposed lakebed, slowly weathering. A small drive-in movie theater, made entirely of car-shaped sculptures, replaced the one that had closed. Telephone booths stood alone in the salt flats, pointing nowhere. A wooden house tilted into the dust at a 45-degree angle, as if it was sinking. The town that had been left to die had become one of the strangest open-air galleries on the continent. The lake, meanwhile, kept dying. Today, if you drive east from San Diego on the desert highways and turn down toward the Salton Sea, the first thing you notice is the smell. It is faint at the highway, stronger as you descend into the trough, and unmistakable at the shoreline. A chemical, mineral, biological smell that has no real equivalent anywhere else in California. The lake is still there. It is still receding. Mountains of dried fish bones still line the beaches, and the small grid of trailers at Bombay Beach is still inhabited by perhaps 150 year-round residents, plus a slowly rotating cast of artists and photographers and people who, for whatever combination of reasons, find that the most apocalyptic place in California is also the most beautiful. There are still no chain stores. There is one bar. There is one art space. The drive-in is still made of car sculptures. The grand piano on the lakebed is still slowly weathering. The wooden house is still tilted at 45 degrees. The wind still carries the playa dust on bad days. And in the spring, when the Biennale returns, thousands of visitors come down from Southern California and the Bay Area, and from cities on the other side of the country to walk the salt flats and look at the art and stand on the exposed bones of a celebrity resort that died 60 years before they arrived. So, Bombay Beach carries all of this at once. The river that broke through the irrigation gates in 1905 and accidentally filled the desert. The developer who saw a beachfront in the middle of nowhere and platted a town. The 15-year celebrity boom when the Salton Sea outdrew Yosemite. The slow ecological collapse when the runoff finally became too much. The decades of abandonment. The first photographers. The first installation artists, the Biennale, and underneath all of it, the lake itself, still receding, still slowly evaporating, still on its slow march back to the salt-crusted dust it was for thousands of years before 1905. Many people will never visit Bombay Beach. Many people never knew any of this happened. But now you know. That's the story of Bombay Beach, California, and we're just getting started. If this is your first time here at Los California, welcome. Every week, we go deep on the towns, the disasters, the scandals, the forgotten stories, and the hidden history that made California what it is today. Subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. And leave a comment below telling us which California city or town you want us to cover next. We read everyone. We'll see you there.